You are sitting in a room full of people who all seem completely certain about who the villain is. Nobody argues, nobody hesitates. The story feels so familiar that questioning it almost feels dangerous. You grew up hearing the same image repeated over and over until it became part of your instincts. Satan is the enemy. Satan is evil itself. Satan is the source of everything that goes wrong. But then one day you actually begin reading the texts instead of only remembering what people said about them, and something deeply uncomfortable happens. You notice details that nobody ever mentioned. You realize that your confidence came long before your investigation. That realization is disturbing because it forces you to ask a question that reaches far beyond religion. How many things do we believe simply because they have always been presented in exactly the same way? The human mind craves simple stories. We naturally divide the world into heroes and villains because complexity is exhausting. Every movie teaches us this. Every political movement uses this. Every family has its version of this. There must be someone to blame, someone who carries all the darkness, so everyone else can imagine themselves standing safely on the side of light. That instinct is understandable, but it is also dangerous because reality rarely organizes itself around simple categories. History almost never does. Psychology certainly does not. And religious literature, especially ancient religious literature written across centuries by different authors with different purposes, often turns out to be far more complicated than the summaries we inherit. Consider how often people project their fears onto a single figure. Communities facing uncertainty search for a face that represents everything they fear losing. Individuals do something similar inside their own minds. It is emotionally easier to imagine that temptation comes entirely from outside ourselves than to confront the uncomfortable possibility that much of our struggle originates within us. If every destructive impulse belongs to an external enemy, then responsibility becomes easier to manage emotionally. We can picture ourselves as victims under attack instead of complicated people capable of both generosity and cruelty. This psychological pattern appears across cultures because it answers a deep emotional need. It simplifies guilt. It simplifies failure. It simplifies identity. But simplification is not always the same thing as truth. When people begin examining the biblical text themselves, they often discover that the figure called Satan develops over time. The earliest passages present a picture that differs significantly from the one many modern readers imagine. In some of the oldest texts, the Hebrew term commonly translated as Satan functions more like an accuser or adversary than as an independent cosmic ruler of evil. In the opening chapters of the book of Job, for example, the figure appears within the divine court rather than outside it, challenging the sincerity of human righteousness. Whether one interprets that account historically, theologically, or symbolically, it presents a literary role that is considerably more nuanced than the image of an absolute rival waging equal war against God. Many biblical scholars argue that this reflects an earlier stage in the development of Israelite religious thought, while later Jewish and Christian traditions expanded and reshaped the character in response to changing theological questions and historical experiences. That does not settle the theological debate, but it demonstrates that the picture has never been as simple as popular imagination often assumes. This is where psychology becomes fascinating. Human beings dislike ambiguity. We prefer complete certainty because certainty provides emotional security even when evidence remains incomplete. Once an idea becomes tied to our identity, questioning it feels like betrayal rather than investigation. Imagine someone discovering that a family story repeated for generations contains important details that were left out. The emotional reaction is rarely excitement. It is often anxiety. The facts threaten belonging. They threaten stability. They threaten relationships. Religion is hardly unique in this respect. Nations tell simplified stories about their origins. Families tell simplified stories about relatives. Individuals tell simplified stories about themselves. We edit memory to preserve identity. Communities do something similar with tradition. That does not mean the tradition is false. It means human beings naturally compress complexity into narratives that are easier to remember and easier to defend. Think about the language people use every day. Someone loses a job after years of ignoring warning signs, and they say the devil attacked them. Another person destroys a relationship through dishonesty, but insists evil forces ruined everything. Sometimes that interpretation reflects sincere religious belief. Sometimes it functions psychologically as a shield against painful self-examination. Blaming an external force can protect the ego from confronting uncomfortable responsibility. This does not mean spiritual explanations are impossible. It means psychological explanations deserve consideration as well. Mature thinking often requires holding multiple possibilities in tension rather than immediately choosing whichever explanation feels emotionally satisfying. That habit is difficult because our brains reward certainty. We experience relief when uncertainty disappears, even if it disappears through premature conclusions. The irony is that ancient religious literature frequently invites wrestling rather than instant resolution. The patriarchs wrestle, the prophets question, the wisdom literature argues. Entire books exist because faithful people struggled with difficult questions instead of pretending everything was obvious. Yet many modern discussions become strangely uncomfortable whenever complexity appears. Why? Because certainty creates strong communities. Shared certainty builds trust. Shared uncertainty demands patience. Patience is much harder to organize than certainty. Philosophers have long recognized that every culture creates symbolic figures representing chaos, order, temptation, justice, wisdom, and destruction. Those figures help societies think about invisible realities through memorable stories. Whether one approaches Satan primarily as a literal personal being, as many religious believers sincerely do, or examines the figure through literary, historical, and psychological lenses, one striking observation remains. The character repeatedly forces attention toward human choice. Even in narratives where external temptation exists, human beings still make decisions. Responsibility never disappears completely. That observation matters because modern culture often searches desperately for someone else to blame. If circumstances explain everything, then personal responsibility shrinks. If biology explains everything, responsibility shrinks. If society explains everything, responsibility shrinks. If supernatural forces explain everything, responsibility can shrink there as well. Ancient texts repeatedly resist such easy escape. They portray people making decisions with consequences, even while acknowledging powerful influences around them. That tension feels profoundly realistic, because real life is rarely reducible to a single cause. A marriage fails because of dozens of accumulated decisions rather than one dramatic moment. A nation collapses through generations of choices rather than one afternoon. Character forms through repeated habits more often than spectacular events. The human mind prefers dramatic villains because dramatic villains provide emotional closure. Reality usually offers patterns instead. This becomes especially interesting when examining how later literature, art, and popular imagination influenced religious understanding. Across centuries, poets, painters, dramatists, and storytellers expanded images that eventually became more familiar than the biblical passages themselves. Cultural memory often absorbs artistic interpretation until people struggle to distinguish one from the other. This phenomenon appears everywhere. Ask someone about historical events, and they frequently remember scenes from films rather than documented history. Ask them about famous individuals, and they often recall myths shaped by later storytelling. Religious imagination has experienced similar processes, recognizing that influence does not require abandoning faith. It simply encourages intellectual honesty about how traditions evolve and how interpretations accumulate over time. Another uncomfortable observation emerges when we examine why people need villains psychologically. Villains create moral distance. If evil belongs entirely to someone else, then ordinary people can imagine themselves fundamentally different. Yet history consistently demonstrates that ordinary individuals are capable of extraordinary cruelty under certain conditions. Social psychology repeatedly reveals how conformity, authority, fear, and group identity influence behavior. People who consider themselves decent sometimes participate in harmful systems without recognizing their role because everyone around them behaves similarly. This should make us cautious about locating evil exclusively outside ourselves. Some religious thinkers have emphasized exactly this point for centuries. The greatest danger may not always be the dramatic enemy we imagine, but the unnoticed compromises we justify every day. Pride rarely announces itself proudly. Self-deception rarely identifies itself honestly. Resentment often disguises itself as justice. Envy presents itself as fairness. Fear presents itself as wisdom. These internal dynamics deserve attention, regardless of one's theological conclusions about Satan, because they shape everyday life in observable ways. Imagine leaving work convinced that everyone else is responsible for your unhappiness, while never examining your own habits, expectations, communication, or bitterness. That mindset becomes its own prison. The search for external villains can become a way of avoiding internal transformation. At the same time, reducing every religious concept to psychology alone may overlook dimensions that many believers genuinely experience and understand differently. That is why responsible discussion distinguishes between historical evidence, scholarly interpretation, theological conviction, and personal belief instead of pretending every question has been settled beyond dispute. The point is not to replace one unquestionable certainty with another. The point is to notice how quickly human beings mistake familiarity for proof. The image you inherited may contain genuine theological insight. It may also contain centuries of interpretation layered upon ancient texts in ways that deserve careful examination. Asking those questions is not intellectual rebellion for its own sake. It is an act of taking ideas seriously enough to investigate them rather than merely repeating them. Independent thought requires courage because every honest investigation risks discovering that reality is more complicated than we hoped. Sometimes our conclusions remain unchanged after deeper study. Sometimes they evolve. Sometimes they become more nuanced rather than completely different. That is not weakness, it is intellectual maturity. The question worth carrying tonight is not simply whether Satan is the villain you think he is. The deeper question is whether you have ever separated what the texts actually say from what culture, repetition, memory, and assumption taught you to expect. If that question makes you even slightly uncomfortable, then it has already accomplished something valuable, because the beginning of wisdom is often not the arrival of certainty, but the willingness to examine certainty itself. If these conversations help you think more carefully, question more honestly, and distinguish confidence from evidence, consider subscribing so we can keep exploring difficult ideas with curiosity instead of fear. Think about the last time someone disappointed you. Maybe it was a friend who betrayed your trust, a co-worker who took credit for your work, or someone you loved who quietly became a stranger. Your first instinct was probably to search for a reason that made the pain easier to understand. Human beings are natural storytellers, and stories demand causes. We rarely accept that complicated outcomes emerge from dozens of small choices made over months or years. We prefer one decisive explanation because it gives our minds somewhere to land. This tendency extends far beyond personal relationships. It shapes politics, history, economics, and religion. The search for a single villain satisfies an emotional need even when reality refuses to cooperate. This is one reason discussions about Satan often become more revealing about human psychology than about the figure itself. The conversation exposes how we think about responsibility, temptation, justice, and the uncomfortable possibility that our greatest struggles cannot always be blamed on someone else. Throughout history, societies under pressure have frequently personified chaos. Ancient civilizations surrounded by war, famine, disease, and uncertainty developed symbolic language to describe forces that seemed larger than any individual. Those symbols helped people organize experiences that otherwise felt impossible to explain. The Hebrew Bible emerged within that broader ancient world, yet its portrayal of evil developed differently across time. Many scholars observe that earlier biblical texts focus heavily on human disobedience, covenant faithfulness, and the consequences of collective choices, while later Jewish writings from the Second Temple period display a growing interest in supernatural opposition, cosmic conflict, and rebellious spiritual beings. Historical circumstances may help explain part of that development. Repeated invasions, exile, foreign empires, and cultural upheaval encouraged deeper reflection on why suffering exists and whether unseen powers participate in human history. These developments became influential for later Christian theology, but recognizing that evolution is not the same as dismissing belief. It simply acknowledges that ideas often become clearer, richer, and more complex across generations. That pattern appears in philosophy, science, law, and literature as well. Understanding how concepts develop is different from claiming they were invented. It is an invitation to distinguish between the earliest textual evidence and later interpretive traditions. This distinction matters because many people unknowingly combine passages written centuries apart into a single seamless narrative that the texts themselves never explicitly present. Once you notice that, you begin asking better questions. Which ideas come directly from the biblical text? Which come from later theological reflection? Which entered popular imagination through art, poetry, medieval literature, films, and cultural repetition? These questions are intellectually healthy because they encourage careful reading instead of passive assumption. They also reveal how powerful communities are in shaping what feels obvious. If everyone around you repeats the same interpretation from childhood onward, eventually the interpretation becomes psychologically indistinguishable from the text itself. That phenomenon is not unique to religion. It happens whenever traditions are transmitted across generations. Memory compresses details. Teaching emphasizes certain themes while overlooking others. Cultural priorities influence which passages receive attention and which remain unfamiliar. This does not necessarily happen through deception. More often it happens because human beings simplify complexity in order to communicate it. The problem arises when simplification becomes mistaken for completeness. The human mind is remarkably efficient at filling gaps with familiar assumptions. Once a framework has been accepted, confirmation bias quietly begins its work. We notice evidence supporting our expectations and overlook information that complicates them. Confirmation bias is not evidence of dishonesty. It is an ordinary feature of cognition affecting nearly everyone. Scientists design experiments to reduce it. Historians compare multiple sources because of it. Courts establish procedures intended to counteract it. Yet in everyday life, we often assume we are immune. Imagine reading a difficult passage while already convinced you know what it means. Your attention naturally gravitates toward familiar interpretations, while alternative possibilities barely register. This is one reason sincere people can reach different conclusions while reading the same material. They bring different assumptions, traditions, languages, and questions to the text, recognizing that reality should produce humility rather than hostility. Confidence alone cannot determine which interpretation is correct. Careful reasoning, historical context, linguistic study, and intellectual honesty all matter. Another layer of the discussion concerns temptation itself. People often imagine temptation as something dramatic arriving from outside, but ordinary experience suggests a more complicated picture. Temptation frequently emerges through perfectly ordinary desires pushed beyond healthy boundaries. The desire for security becomes greed. The desire for recognition becomes vanity. The desire for justice becomes vengeance. The desire for belonging becomes conformity. None of those desires begin as inherently destructive. They become destructive when pursued without wisdom or restraint. Many religious thinkers throughout history have emphasized this internal dimension. Whether one attributes temptation primarily to psychological processes, spiritual realities, or some combination of both, the daily experience often looks remarkably similar. We rationalize, we justify, we postpone difficult conversations, we convince ourselves that small compromises are harmless until they accumulate into habits shaping our character. This gradual process is far less dramatic than popular images of supernatural confrontation, yet it is recognizable to almost everyone. You probably remember moments when you ignored your conscience, not because someone forced you, but because the easier option felt more appealing. Those moments reveal something profound about the human condition. External influences may exist according to many theological perspectives, but they never fully erase personal agency. That insight appears repeatedly throughout biblical literature. Human beings are portrayed as morally significant actors whose decisions matter. Even when outside pressures exist, accountability remains. This emphasis distinguishes many biblical narratives from deterministic worldviews in which people function merely as victims of irresistible forces. It also explains why so much biblical wisdom literature focuses on habits, discipline, honesty, compassion, and self-examination. These themes assume that ordinary choices accumulate into extraordinary consequences over time. Modern psychology often reaches similar conclusions through different methods and language. Behavioral patterns become reinforced through repetition. Identity forms through repeated actions. Environments shape decisions, yet individuals still possess meaningful opportunities to respond differently. Neither perspective reduces life to a single cause. Both acknowledge complexity. That complexity can be frustrating because it denies us the emotional comfort of simple answers. Yet it may also be closer to reality. Consider how often we explain failure using whichever narrative protects our identity most effectively. Success is frequently attributed to our intelligence, discipline, or virtue, while failure is explained through unfair circumstances, difficult people, or invisible opposition. Everyone does this to some extent. Honest self-reflection requires noticing the pattern rather than assuming it belongs only to others. The figure of Satan, regardless of one's theological conclusions, often becomes a mirror reflecting these deeper psychological habits. Are we using the concept to avoid responsibility, or are we using it to better understand moral struggle? Are we reading ancient texts carefully, or are we repeating inherited assumptions without examination? Are we interested in discovering what is true, or merely defending what feels familiar? Those questions reach beyond religion because they apply to every deeply held belief. Intellectual integrity begins when we become willing to investigate ideas that are emotionally expensive to question. Most people assume courage appears only in dramatic public moments, yet some of the greatest courage is quiet. It appears when someone admits they may have misunderstood something they defended for years. It appears when evidence complicates identity. It appears when belonging no longer determines belief. That process can be lonely because communities often reward certainty more than curiosity. Yet history repeatedly shows that progress in knowledge usually begins with individuals willing to ask questions that initially make others uncomfortable. The goal is not endless skepticism for its own sake. Endless skepticism can become another form of dogmatism. The goal is disciplined curiosity, guided by evidence, humility, and careful reasoning. That attitude allows faith, philosophy, history, and psychology to engage one another without reducing every disagreement to hostility. It also reminds us that sincere conviction and accurate understanding are not always identical. People throughout history have sincerely believed many things later shown to be incomplete, and they have also sincerely defended truths that endured careful scrutiny. Sincerity matters, but sincerity alone cannot settle questions of fact. That is why careful examination remains valuable. When discussions about Satan move beyond slogans and inherited assumptions, they become conversations about human nature itself. They ask why people fear uncertainty, why communities create powerful narratives, why identity resists change, and why responsibility is often more difficult to accept than blame. Those questions remain relevant, regardless of where someone ultimately lands theologically, because they illuminate patterns present in everyday life. The more honestly we examine those patterns, the less likely we are to mistake repetition for evidence or familiarity for certainty. Independent thought is rarely comfortable, but it is often where genuine understanding begins. If these reflections challenge you to read more carefully, think more critically, and approach difficult questions with both humility and courage, then continue exploring them with an open mind and a commitment to following evidence wherever it leads. Imagine reaching the end of a lifelong investigation only to discover that the biggest surprise was never the answer itself. The biggest surprise was realizing how often you confused certainty with understanding. That realization is humbling because it exposes something universal about the human mind. We all inherit stories before we evaluate them. We inherit language before we understand it. We inherit assumptions before we know they are assumptions. The question is not whether this happens. It happens to everyone. The real question is what we do once we become aware of it. Do we become defensive, or do we become curious? Do we protect our identity at all costs, or do we allow our understanding to mature? Conversations about Satan frequently reveal this deeper crossroads because they touch one of the oldest questions humanity has ever asked. Where does evil come from? Every civilization has wrestled with that mystery. Every generation has offered its own answers. Some have emphasized supernatural rebellion. Others have focused on human freedom. Others have explored social structures, psychological drives, or philosophical explanations about the nature of suffering itself. None of these approaches emerged in a vacuum. Each reflects the questions, experiences, and historical circumstances of the people who developed them. That is why responsible interpretation requires more than isolated verses or familiar slogans. It requires patience. It requires context. It requires recognizing that ancient texts were written to real communities facing real crises, rather than modern audiences carrying 21st century assumptions. When people speak confidently about what everyone has always believed, history often tells a more complicated story. Within Judaism, Christianity, and even among different traditions inside Christianity itself, there have long been meaningful differences regarding the identity, role, and activity of Satan. Some theological traditions place greater emphasis on personal spiritual conflict. Others stress the corruption of human desires, the brokenness of creation, or the consequences of collective injustice. These perspectives are not identical, and they should not be collapsed into a single voice. Acknowledging diversity within religious interpretation is not an attack on belief. It is an observation about history. Once we recognize that thoughtful people have reached different conclusions while taking the same text seriously, intellectual humility becomes much easier to practice. Humility does not require abandoning conviction. It simply means recognizing that confidence should grow from careful investigation rather than from familiarity alone. That distinction becomes increasingly important in an age where information spreads faster than understanding. A statement repeated thousands of times online can begin to feel self-evident, even when few people have examined its foundations. The same psychological mechanisms that shaped communities centuries ago continue operating today. Social media accelerates them, but it did not invent them. People naturally gather around narratives reinforcing their existing worldview. They reward agreement. They distrust ideas that threaten shared identity. This tendency affects believers and skeptics alike because it reflects ordinary human cognition rather than one particular ideology. The challenge, then, is learning to distinguish between genuine inquiry and the emotional comfort of belonging. Sometimes the hardest question is not whether an idea is true, but whether we would be willing to change our minds if convincing evidence pointed elsewhere. That question reaches into every area of life. It applies to religion, politics, relationships, and even the stories we tell about ourselves. Most people imagine self-deception as something dramatic, yet it is often subtle. It appears in the excuses we repeat until they sound like facts. It appears in the memories we edit to protect our self-image. It appears when we selectively remember events, confirming what we already wanted to believe. None of this makes us uniquely flawed. It makes us recognizably human. Ancient wisdom traditions repeatedly warned about these tendencies long before psychology gave them modern terminology. They cautioned against pride, self-righteousness, and the illusion that seeing clearly is effortless. Those warnings remain relevant because intelligence alone does not eliminate bias. Highly educated people can rationalize false conclusions just as effectively as anyone else when identity becomes involved. That realization should make every serious thinker slower to dismiss opposing viewpoints and quicker to examine their own assumptions. Returning to the figure of Satan through this lens reveals something unexpected. Whether someone understands Satan primarily as a literal spiritual being, a symbolic literary figure, or through another theological framework, the discussion repeatedly circles back to the same central challenge. Human beings must confront themselves. Ancient stories often become mirrors before they become answers. They expose fear, ambition, resentment, loyalty, courage, and self-deception. They ask what kind of people we are becoming rather than merely what information we possess. Knowledge without self-examination easily becomes arrogance. Self-examination without knowledge easily becomes confusion. Wisdom requires both. This may explain why the most enduring religious texts continue generating discussion thousands of years after they were written. They refuse to remain simple. Every generation brings new questions because every generation faces new circumstances while struggling with the same fundamental aspects of human nature. We still seek meaning. We still fear suffering. We still wrestle with guilt. We still long for justice. We still hope that good can ultimately overcome evil, however we understand those realities. The language changes, but the underlying questions remain remarkably consistent. Perhaps that is why debates about Satan never disappear. They are rarely only about one character. They are conversations about responsibility, freedom, temptation, hope, and the mystery of why human beings so often act against their own values. They are also reminders that easy answers may satisfy emotions more quickly than they satisfy careful reasoning. If there is one lesson worth carrying forward, it is that intellectual courage does not begin with having every answer. It begins with refusing to confuse inherited certainty with demonstrated truth. It begins with reading carefully, instead of assuming familiarity equals understanding. It begins with recognizing that genuine confidence grows stronger through honest examination rather than weaker. Whether your investigation ultimately reinforces long-held beliefs, reshapes them, or leaves some questions unresolved, the process itself has value. It develops habits of attention, patience, and humility that extend far beyond religious discussion. Those habits influence how we evaluate news, judge other people, remember the past, and imagine the future. They help us become less vulnerable to manipulation by simple narratives, promising perfect certainty in an imperfect world. Reality often resists neat categories, and perhaps that is precisely why it deserves our careful attention. The most meaningful discoveries rarely occur when we search only for confirmation. They happen when we become willing to follow evidence with honesty, acknowledge complexity without fear, and admit that understanding is often a lifelong pursuit rather than a destination. If this exploration has encouraged you to question more carefully, think more deeply, and approach difficult ideas with both curiosity and intellectual humility, then stay with these conversations. Not because questioning is an end in itself, but because the search for truth is strengthened when we are willing to examine even the beliefs that feel most familiar.